People always want to know what goes on behind the face. They see a man in a red tunic and a tall bearskin, white gloves folded over a rifle, eyes set on the middle distance, and they decide there is nothing back there at all. A statue, a decoration, something the palace puts out for the cameras the way it puts out the flags. I stood that line for 11 years, and I can tell you that the stillness is not emptiness. It is the hardest work a man can do. To hold yourself like that, hour upon hour, while the world leans in to find the crack, that takes more discipline than any of them will ever spend in a lifetime. But I am getting ahead of myself. I want to tell you about a day at Hartsmere, on the regimental ranges below the old East Terrace, when a famous man decided I was a parade doll and said so, and dared me in front of 1,000 people to prove him wrong. I want to tell you what happened next, and why I let it happen the way I did slowly, when I could have ended it in a sentence. Because the ending is not the part that matters. The holding is the part that matters. The ending only tells you what the holding was for. My name is Edmund Hale. By that summer I had been a guardsman of the King's Foot for the better part of my life, and before that I had been something else entirely, something I did not speak of and did not write down and did not let cross my own mind more than I had to. The palace had taken me in when the war was done with me, the way it takes in a certain kind of man, quiet, steady, used to standing where he is put and not moving until he is told. They gave me a tunic and a rifle that fired blanks for the salutes, and they gave me a post, and I was grateful. A post is a good thing for a man who has spent too long deciding when other men would live. A post asks nothing of you but to be exactly where you are. I had wanted to be exactly where I was for a long time. Hartsmere is not the grand seat. That is Castellane in the city, where the crowds gather at the gates and the changing of the guard draws the tour buses. Hartsmere is the country palace, the crown's old hunting house grown into something larger over 300 years, set in a fold of green hills with the long ranges built into the slope behind it where the regiments had trained since before anyone living could remember. Twice a year the gates opened to the public for the charity days, and the people came up the gravel drives with their children and their picnic baskets, and the regiments put on their displays, and the money raised went to the soldiers' homes and the veterans' funds. It was a good day those days. There was something honest in them. The discipline was on show, but the discipline was in service of something, the old men in their wheelchairs along the rope line, the widows, the boys missing limbs who had once worn the same wool I wore. We stood straighter for them than we ever did for the cameras. That year the committee had arranged a star turn. The charity wanted a draw, something to put on the posters, and they had landed a man named Roland Ackley. You will not have heard the name because I have changed it, the way I have changed all of this, the place, the house, the faces, to keep faith with people who never asked to be in a story. But you have known the man. Every field has one. Ackley was the most celebrated competitive marksman of his generation, a champion of the great international meets, a holder of records that men half his age could not approach. He had a face the magazines liked and a way of holding himself that said he knew it. He traveled with a small retinue, a manager, a coach, a young woman with a clipboard who seemed to exist only to agree with him, and he had been paid a great deal of money, I later learned, to come up to Hartsmere and shoot a demonstration round on the long range while the crowd watched, and then to judge a charity competition among the public, and to be photographed a great many times doing both. He was very good. I want to be fair to him because what came after has made it tempting to remember him as a fool, and he was not a fool. He could put a group on a target at distances that would make a journeyman weep, and he could do it with a crowd breathing down his neck and a band playing somewhere behind him, which is harder than the distance, harder than anything. He had earned his name. The trouble with Ackley was not that he was less than he claimed. The trouble was that he had decided, somewhere along the road to all those medals, that the world divided cleanly into men like him and everything else, and that everything else existed to admire him. And on that bright morning, standing in his pale shooting coat on the firing line with the sun on him and the cameras turning, He looked down the rope toward the row of us in our red wool and our bearskins, sweating and motionless, and he decided we were everything else. I was posted at the end of the ceremonial line that morning, nearest the firing point, where the rope ran from a brass stanchion across to the safety officer's hut. It was warm for the season. The wool tunic in real heat is its own particular education. It sits on you like a second man, and the bearskin holds the sun on the crown of your head until you can feel your own pulse in your temples. You learn to go away inside it. You find a spot in the air 30 feet off and you put your eyes there, and you let the heat and the noise and the hours wash over the outside of you while the inside of you keeps its own counsel. I had a great deal of counsel to keep. I always did. The morning ran as these mornings run. The band played. The young troopers did their riding display, and the dogs did their work, and a sergeant I knew gave a talk on the history of the regiment to a circle of attentive children, and the smell of frying onions came up from the food tents on the breeze. Then the loudspeaker announced the great man, and the crowd thickened along the ropes behind the firing line, and Ackley came out to his applause. He shot his demonstration, and it was a fine thing to watch, even for me, who had reason to be hard to impress. He took his targets at 300 yards and then at 5, calling his shots before he made them, and the spotter's flag came up white each time to say he had struck the inner ring, and the crowd made the sound a crowd makes when it is given exactly what it came for. Ackley turned and lifted a hand and let them have their noise. He was generous with himself that way. And then, the demonstration done and the applause settling, he came down off the firing point and along toward the rope where we stood, and the young woman with the clipboard came after him, and a man with a camera, and he stopped in front of the line of us as a man might stop in front of a row of suits of armor in a hall, to remark upon them. "Now these," he said, loud enough to carry half to his retinue and half to the people pressing at the rope, "these are the real thing, aren't they, the genuine article?" He walked the line slowly. He looked us up and down. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. You couldn't pay for this in a film. He stopped in front of the man 2 down from me, a young guardsman named Pell, not yet 22, who had been on the line 9 months and was still learning the hard art of going away inside the heat. Ackley leaned in close to him, close enough that Pell could surely smell the man's cologne, and studied his face like a portrait. "Look at that," Ackley said. "Not a flicker. Marvelous. Do you train them not to blink? Is that a thing?" The crowd laughed because it was meant kindly, more or less, the way a man is kind to a horse he admires. Pell did not move. He was doing well. I was proud of him in a quiet way, the way you are proud of a younger man holding his ground. Then Ackley came to me. I do not know why he chose me. Perhaps because I was the oldest on the line and there was gray in the stubble under the chin strap, and a man like that prefers his targets to have a little dignity to take off them. Perhaps it was nothing, the chance of where he happened to stop. He looked at me a moment, and something in my stillness must have struck him as a challenge rather than a curiosity, because his face changed. The amusement in it sharpened into something with an edge. "This one's the colonel of the bunch, I'd say," he announced. "Look at him, solid as the gateposts." He put his face near mine the way he had with Pell, but with me he held it longer, searching the way a man searches a locked door for the give in it. I gave him the spot in the air 30 feet off. I gave him nothing. "Tell me something, soldier," he said, dropping his voice, but not so far that it didn't carry, the way a showman drops a voice to make a crowd lean in. "All this kit, the medals, that rifle, have you ever fired a shot in your life that mattered, a real one? Or is it all," he waved a hand at the wool, the brass, the bearskin, all dress-up, the parade, the doll in the window? He smiled, and the smile was for the crowd, an invitation to them to enjoy this with him. "Because I've spent my whole life on the line that actually counts. And I look at you lot and I think, God love you, you're a beautiful piece of furniture. But you wouldn't last 10 seconds where the shooting's real." There it was, the thing said out loud. I want to be honest about what happened inside me, because the inside is the only part of this worth telling. The first thing I felt was not anger. I had spent a great deal of myself learning not to reach for anger, because anger is fast, and a fast man on a long shot is a dead man, and the habits of the long shot had built the inside of me and never quite left. What I felt first was a kind of weary recognition. I had heard the music of it before, not those exact words, but the tune of them, the certainty of a man who has only ever stood on one kind of ground, deciding he understands all the other kinds. I had heard it from young officers fresh from the academy who thought the war was a thing you could read your way through. I had heard it once from a man across a valley I will not name, through 12 power of glass. In the last moment before the work I did made the certainty go out of his face. I knew the tune, and the second thing I felt, riding in just behind the recognition, was the old cold quiet coming up in me like water filling a still room, the quiet I had not let into myself in 11 years, the quiet I had taken the tunic precisely to be rid of. Behind that unmoving face I can tell you exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking, do not let it in. I was thinking of the rope line, the old men in their chairs, the boys who had paid in flesh for the right to sit there and be thanked. I was thinking of the post. A post asks nothing of you but to be where you are put. I was where I was put. So I held the spot in the air, and I did not move, and I let Roland Ackley have his moment, and the crowd gave him the small, uneasy laugh of people who can feel a thing has gone a half step too far and are not quite sure whose fault it is. He straightened, satisfied, and turned to go back to his retinue. And he might have gone, and this would be no story, except that as he turned his eye fell on my hands. A man's hands tell on him. The face you can train. I had trained mine for a decade and a half until it would have held its line through an earthquake. But the hands keep their own history, and mine had a habit they had carried out of the war and never lost. A small thing. The way the right forefinger lay along the side of the rifle's stock, not curled toward where a trigger would be on a real weapon, but laid flat and easy. The discipline of a man who has been taught to the bone that the finger stays off the trigger until the decision is made, and who has made the decision often enough that the keeping off has worn a groove in him. It is not how a ceremonial guard holds a rifle. It is how a working marksman holds one. Ackley had spent his life around men's hands on weapons. He saw it. I watched him see it, and I watched something cross his face that was not amusement and was not quite suspicion, but was the first cousin of both, the look of a man who has been told a thing and half believes it might not be true. He came back. "You've held a rifle properly," he said, quietly now just to me. The crowd could not hear this part. "Where?" I said nothing. There is a great deal you can say with nothing if you have practiced. The not saying decided him. Whatever doubt had flickered in him, my silence read to a man like Ackley as the silence of a beaten thing, and his confidence came flooding back, and with it the showman, and he stepped back and lifted his voice for the crowd again. And now there was a cruelty in it that had not been there before, the cruelty of a man who suspects he has been made briefly uncertain and means to punish someone for it. "You know what?" he called out to the rope, to the cameras, to the whole bright morning. "I've got an idea. I've got an idea the people'll like." He spread his arms. "We've a competition this afternoon, don't we? The public round. Anyone can have a go, all for the charity. So here's what I say. I say one of these fine gentlemen ought to step off his little rope and come up to the line and show us what's under all that wool. What do we think?" The crowd, sensing a spectacle, made its noise. "Come on then, Colonel," Ackley said, turning back to me, and the grin was all teeth now. "You and me. Off you come. Let's see if the parade doll can shoot, or if he's just been standing there for 11 years keeping the pigeons off." And there it was, the whole of it, laid out in the sunshine. The dare, in front of 1,000 people and a dozen cameras, with the loudspeaker carrying it to the food tents and the car parks and beyond. I will tell you what most men do not understand about a moment like that, having never been handed one. They imagine the difficulty is in being brave enough. It is not. The difficulty is in being still enough. Every cell in a man wants to answer a thing like that. The crowd wants you to answer it. You can feel them wanting it, a pressure on the skin. The young guardsman down the line wants you to answer it, for the honor of the regiment. Your own old pride, The part of you that was good at a thing once and has been pretending for 11 years that it does not miss being good at it, wants more than anything to answer it. To stand still under all of that, to let the contempt land and stay landed, to be the furniture the man called you, that is the hard thing. That is the work. So I stood still. I held the line. The committee man, a decent fellow named Cruz who ran the charity days, came hurrying down looking pale, sensing trouble, and there was a flurry of low talk among Ackley's people, and the loudspeaker filled the gap with something cheerful about the falconry display starting by the lower hedge. The pressure of the crowd, denied its spectacle, began to ebb. And Roland Ackley, robbed of his contest, looked at me a long moment with the grin curdling, and then he did the only thing left to a man like him to do, which was to award himself the victory. "There it is," he said, soft, just for me again, and the softness was worse than the shouting. "There's your answer, then. 11 years of dress-up and not the nerve to pick up a rifle when it's pointed out he's a fraud. I'll tell you what you are, soldier." He leaned in for the last of it. "You're the costume. There was never a man in it." Then he turned on his heel and went back up to the firing point to be admired, and the morning went on, and the band played, and I stood my post until the relief came at noon, and I marched off the line with the rest, and not one of the 1,000 people there that morning knew that they had watched a man come within a single sentence of saying the thing that would have changed all their faces. Because I knew the thing, I had only to say it, and I had decided in the heat under the bearskin that I would not. In the cool of the guardroom, with the tunic off and the sweat drying and the kettle going, the young guardsman Pell could not let it lie. He was angry on my behalf in the open way the young are, before they have learned that the open ways cost too much. "You should have gone up there," he said. "Sergeant Hale, you should have gone up there and put one through the middle and watched his face. He was packing. Everyone heard him. He called us, he called you in front of all of them, and you just stood there." "That's the job," I said. "The job's not letting some." He caught the word before it came out because we did not curse in that room. It was not who we were. "Some peacock call you a fraud in front of your own people. Sergeant, I've seen you on the long course. I've seen what you do with the old service rifle on a Sunday when you think no one's watching. I don't know where you learned it, but it isn't from any parade. You could have buried him." I made the tea. I am a great believer in making the tea. It gives the hands something honest to do while the mind decides what is worth saying. "Let me tell you something, Pell," I said, "and then we'll let it go." I gave him his mug. "A man like that, when you beat him, you don't change him, you confirm him. He spends his whole life in contests. Everything is a contest. That's the only weather he knows. If I'd gone up there this morning and beaten him, do you know what he'd have learned? He'd have learned that I was a contestant too. Just another fellow who couldn't bear to be doubted, who had to pick up the rifle and prove it. He'd have respected me, in his way, and he'd have been exactly the same man tomorrow as he was today. Only with a story about the soldier who turned out to be a ringer." I drank some tea. "The thing he cannot understand, the thing that would actually cost him something, is a man who can shoot and chooses not to. A man who hears 'prove it' and is not moved. That's the only lesson he's never had. And you don't teach it by taking the bait. You teach it by being the one thing his whole life has told him doesn't exist." Pell sat down. He was quiet a while. "So you just take it," he said finally, but the anger had gone out of it. It was a real question now. "For now," I said, "I just take it. And I will be honest with you, as I was not quite honest with the boy. There was a part of me, drinking that tea, that knew for now was doing a great deal of work in the sentence. Because the cold quiet had come up in me at the rope, the old water filling the old room, and I had got the lid back on it, but I had felt how thin the lid had worn. And I knew there was an afternoon yet to come. What I had not yet learned, sitting in the guardroom, was who else was at Hartsmere that day. The afternoon competition was the heart of the charity event. A public shooting match on the medium range, 300 yards, with the old training rifles the regiment kept for exactly this, fired off a rest at paper targets, Anyone of the crowd welcome to put their name down and have 3 shots for a few coins to the soldiers' fund. It was a gentle, festive thing in the ordinary run of years, families taking turns, fathers showing off mildly to their children, the regimental marksmen running it with great patience and good humor. That year, with Ackley as the star, it had swelled. The committee had made a real competition of it, with a board and a running tally and a small silver cup, and Ackley himself was to be the celebrity entrant, shooting against all comers, and the loudspeaker had been promising all morning that the great champion would take on any challenger who fancied his chances. It was good theater. It would raise a great deal of money, and it gave Roland Ackley, who had been denied his spectacle at the rope that morning, a stage built precisely to his measure. I had no intention of going near it. My shift was done. I was off the line. I could have changed into my own clothes and walked down to watch the falconry and let the day close over the morning like water over a stone. That had been my plan, and it was a good plan, and I think I might even have kept to it, except that as the afternoon competition was getting under way, with Ackley up at the firing point dispatching challenger after challenger to the polite groans of the crowd, an old man in a wheelchair was brought down the path by an orderly and parked at the end of the rope, in the shade, with a rug over his knees though the day was warm. I knew him at once. You do not forget a man under whom you served, however many years pass, however much smaller the years have made him. He was very old now, and the stroke had taken some of his face, and the hands that had once held the whole of an Eastern campaign together lay still in his lap. But the eyes were the eyes. Colonel Aldous Marrow, who had commanded the reconnaissance and observation troop in the war I did not speak of, the small, strange unit of patient men whose work was to lie still in the high ground above the Calderon valleys and watch and report, and when the order came down and there was no other way to spare the lives below, to make the shot that no one else could make. I had been one of his men. I had been, though I would let no one say it and said it to myself as seldom as I could manage, the best of his men. And the colonel had known it, and had carried the knowing the way good commanders carry such things, lightly in public and very heavily in private, because it was he who had to spend us, and he knew the price of what he spent. I had not seen him in 15 years. I had thought him dead, if I am honest. I had stopped letting myself wonder. And here he was, brought up to Hartsmere by some kind orderly from the soldiers' home to sit in the sun on a charity day and watch the young men ride. He could not have known I was there. There were 100 guardsmen at Hartsmere. We are made on purpose to be indistinguishable. I could have stood 10 feet from him in my tunic, and he'd have seen only the wool and the bearskin, the costume, the thing Ackley said had no man in it. I went and stood near him. I don't fully know why. I told myself it was respect, that you do not let a man who once commanded you sit alone at the end of a rope. I think the truer thing is that the sight of him had finished the work the morning had begun, had lifted the thin worn lid the rest of the way off the cold quiet, because here was the one living man who knew what was under it, who had ordered it into being and watched what it cost, and his being there made the pretending impossible in a way that no insult of Ackley's ever could. Up at the firing point, the champion was enjoying himself. He had just sent another red-faced challenger back to the crowd, a big confident fellow who had talked a great game and then put all 3 of his shots wide, and Ackley was working the laughter, milking it. "Anyone else?" he called. "Anyone at all, don't be shy. It's for the soldiers. Though I'd say the soldiers would rather you just gave them the money and saved everyone the embarrassment." More laughter. He turned, scanning the rope, the showman's eye hunting for the next bit of business, and his gaze swept along the line and found me, in my red wool, standing by the old man in the chair. I saw the recognition light in him, and the morning's grievance with it, the unfinished business, the doubt I had planted with my silence and my flat hands, and I saw him decide all over again that here was sport. "Well now," Ackley called, and the loudspeaker carried it, and the crowd turned to follow his pointing arm, and 1,000 faces swung toward me. "Look who it is, the colonel of the gateposts, my morning's friend," he grinned. Come down to watch the shooting, have you? Couldn't keep away, he let the crowd murmur. Tell you what, soldier, the offer still stands. In fact, he was warming to it, the cruelty and the showmanship braiding together. In fact, I'll make it better. I'll make it sporting. 3 shots, you and me here now in front of everyone. And if the parade doll beats the world champion, I'll double my fee to the soldiers' fund out of my own pocket here today. The crowd made its noise, a big, greedy, delighted noise. They could feel the money and the spectacle both. But if he loses, Ackley lifted a finger, if he loses, he stops standing there pretending. He admits in front of all these good people that it's a costume and there's no soldier in it. That's the wager. That's fair, isn't it? That's more than fair. He spread his arms to the crowd and the crowd roared, and the loudspeaker carried the roar out over the hills, and Roland Ackley turned to me with the whole bright afternoon at his back and said, gently, only for me, the way he'd said the worst things all day. Last chance, furniture. Walk away now and we'll all know what you are. And I will tell you, the old water was high in me now, very high, lapping at the brim. I had the lid in both hands. And I think I might even still, have set it gently back and turned and walked down to the falconry and let him have his afternoon, because I had meant what I told Pell and I believe it yet. The lesson the man needed could not be taught by taking the bait. But then the old man in the chair spoke. He had been watching me. Of course he had. The face does not fool the man who built the discipline behind it. While Ackley played the crowd, Colonel Marrow had been looking up at me from under the rug with the eyes that were still the eyes, and now, in the noise, in a voice the stroke had ruined and slowed but had not silenced, a voice meant for no one but me, he said, "Hale." Just my name. He knew me. Across 15 years and all the wool in the regiment, he knew me by my stillness, because he was the man who had taught me what stillness was for. "Colonel," I said, I did not move my head. "Old habit, you do not give a watcher your eyes." "He's calling you furniture," the old man said, slow, each word a labor. "In front of the boys, the young ones." A long breath. "Are you going to let him tell them that's all you ever were?" Another breath, and something came into the wrecked old voice that I had not heard in 15 years and had not known how much I'd missed, the dry, level, terrible kindness of a commander giving a man the order that will cost him something, because it must be given and there is no one else to give it. "It's not for him, Hale. He doesn't matter, you've got that right. He'll be the same fool tomorrow. It's for the boy down the rope who thinks his job's a joke now. It's for these old men who'll go home thinking the regiment's just a show these days." The eyes held me. "You don't have to beat him for your pride. God knows you've none left to feed. You beat him for them, then you put it down again and you go back to your post. That's an order, soldier. My last one likely, make the shot. You spend 11 years building a wall. And then the one man in the world who knows the right word says the right word. And you find the wall was only ever as strong as your reasons for keeping it. And your reasons have just changed." I straightened my tunic. I have a clear memory of doing it, of running my white glove down the front of the wool to settle it, the small ritual gesture of a man stepping off one kind of ground onto another. I bent and I said to the colonel, quietly, "Sir," in the old way, the only word that was needed. And then I stepped over the rope and walked up the slope to the firing point, into the sun, into the noise. And Roland Ackley watched me come with the grin spreading across his face like a man watching his fish take the hook, never once suspecting that he was the fish. The roar of the crowd as I came up the slope was a strange thing to walk into after 11 years of being scenery. They were cheering the spectacle, not me. They had no idea who I was. For all they knew, I was exactly the parade doll the champion said, come up to be humiliated for their entertainment. And there is an appetite in any crowd for that. An old, ugly appetite that I do not blame them for, because it is in all of us, and the trick is only what we do with it. I let it wash over the outside of me. Inside, the room was very still now, and the water was not the cold panic water I had feared, but something else, something I had forgotten. The deep flat calm of the high ground before a shot, the world gone quiet and slow and enormous, every blade of grass on the slope distinct, The flag on the spotter's post showing me the wind in the way it lifted, the smell of the cut grass and the gun oil and the warm stone, all of it arriving in me sharp and clear the way it used to arrive. The way it had not arrived in 15 years, because I had spent 15 years making sure it never would. The range officer running the competition was a regimental marksman named Sturgis, a sergeant I knew well, and the look on his face when I came up to the line was worth the whole afternoon. He did not say anything. He was too good a soldier to say anything. But his eyebrows did a great deal, and as he handed me the training rifle and the 3 rounds, his fingers, passing them, gave mine the smallest pressure, the old wordless thing between men who have done this work. Go on, then. Sturgis had seen me on the long course on quiet Sundays. Sturgis had wondered, the way they all wondered and never asked, because we do not ask. Now he was about to find out. Ackley was loving it. He shot first. He insisted, the champion's prerogative, and I was glad of it, because I wanted the crowd to see his shooting before they saw mine, so that they would understand. He took his place at the rest, and he made a great theater of it, calling for quiet, settling himself, and then he put 3 rounds downrange into the target at 300 yards in a tight, admirable cluster just inside the inner ring, and the spotter's scope confirmed it and the board went up, and the crowd gave him everything they had. It was very good shooting. I want to be clear about that. By any reasonable measure of a man with a rifle, it was the work of a master, and he had every right to the noise they gave him. He stepped back from the rest and swept his arm toward it, presenting it to me like a host presenting a chair to a guest he intends to watch struggle. All yours, Colonel, he said. 3 in the middle. Off you go, take your time. We've got all afternoon, and so do they. I took my place at the rest. And here is the thing I want you to understand, the thing the whole long day had been built toward, the thing I cannot fully put into words for a man who has never lain on a cold ridge before dawn waiting for the light to come up over a valley where everything depended on the next 4 seconds of his life. When I settled behind that rifle, I did not feel like a man stepping up to a contest. I felt like a man coming home to a house he had locked and walked away from and told himself he would never enter again. Everything in it was where I had left it, the weight of the rifle settling into my shoulder, the cheek to the stock, the eye finding the sights, the breath going out slow and the world narrowing to the small bright circle 300 yards away. The wind off the flag, read without thinking, the way you read a friend's face. The pause at the bottom of the breath, the long still pause that is the whole secret of it, the pause in which a man either has the discipline to wait for the exact moment or does not, and in which I had once waited on that far ridge, longer than any man Marrow ever commanded, because I understood in my bones the thing that Roland Ackley with all his medals had never had to learn, that the shot is not the act. The shot is only the period at the end of the sentence. The discipline is the sentence. The discipline is everything that comes before, the holding, the waiting, the refusing to be hurried by the crowd or the wind or your own pounding want. I did not call my shots the way Ackley had. There was no need. I let the breath go out and I waited at the bottom of it and the world held still, and somewhere in that stillness the trigger went, though I would not have been able to tell you the instant, because by then there was no me deciding and no trigger and no rifle. There was only the small bright circle and the long thread of attention running out to it. I cycled and held and let the breath go and waited, and the trigger went again. And a third time, 3 breaths, 3 pauses, 3 periods at the end of 3 sentences I had been writing my whole life. I had not looked at the target. You do not when you know. You read the wind and you trust the work and you do not flinch toward the result, because flinching toward the result is how men miss. I stood back from the rest and set the rifle down and put my hands behind my back in the old parade rest without thinking, and I looked at the spotter, Sturgis, who had his eye to the scope. Sturgis did not say anything for a moment. The whole range had gone quiet, the strange quiet of a crowd that has sensed, before it understands, that something it did not expect has happened. Sturgis raised his head from the scope. His face was doing the thing faces do when a man has seen something he will tell his grandchildren about. He turned to the range and he turned to the board, and in a voice that he tried to keep level and could not quite, he said the number. 3 rounds. 1 hole. 300 yards. Dead center. The 3 shots had gone through so close together that they had torn a single ragged opening in the very heart of the target, a cluster so tight it would have shamed a Bencrest gun in a cradle, fired offhand by a man in a wool tunic and a bearskin in the warm afternoon, in front of 1,000 strangers, after 11 years of firing nothing but blanks. The crowd did not roar. That is the part I remember most. A roar would have been easier to bear. Instead there was a silence, and then a sound that ran through the silence like a wave, a long indrawn breath of 1,000 people understanding all at once that they had been wrong, that the morning had been wrong, that the man they had come up the slope to watch be humiliated had just done a thing that the world champion in his pale coat could not do, and they all knew it. And into that silence, before the wave could break into noise, came Roland Ackley's voice, and it was a different voice. The showman was gone out of it. What was left was small. "Who are you?" he said. I did not answer him. I had not changed my mind about that. The not answering was still the whole of it. It was the lesson, the only one he had never had, that a man could do the thing and not need to tell him, not need anything from him at all. I put my hands behind my back and I held the spot in the air 30 feet off, the way I had at the rope all morning, the same stillness, except that now every soul on that range understood what the stillness had been holding, and the understanding changed it from a thing they had pitied into a thing they could not look away from. It was the old man who answered, from the end of the rope in the wrecked slow voice, loud enough now somehow to carry. Perhaps the orderly had wheeled him forward, perhaps the silence simply let it reach. Colonel Aldous Marrow gave Roland Ackley the answer. "His name," the old man said, "is Edmund Hale." A breath. The whole range listening. 20 years ago he served under me in the observation troop, in the Calderon campaign in the high country above the valleys, where the work was watching and waiting, and when there was no other way to save the men below, the long shot that no one else could make. Another breath, the words coming slow and terrible and clear. There are men alive today, old men now like me, in homes like mine, who walked out of those valleys because of the patience of this soldier. Because where another man would have taken the shot too soon or too late or not had the nerve to wait, he waited. He held. He did the hardest thing a man with a rifle can do, which is not to fire it. The eyes found Ackley, and there was no cruelty in them, which was worse than cruelty. You asked him this morning if he'd ever fired a shot that mattered. Son, he has fired shots you could not dream of, at things no man should have to save lives you will never know the names of. And then he came here and put on that wool and stood at a rope for 11 years and let people like you call him furniture, and never once told you what he was, because the not telling is the discipline and the discipline is the man. The old voice gentled, the last of it almost kind. You've spent your life learning to hit the middle. He spent his learning when not to. They are not the same skill. One of them is a sport, the other one is a soldier. You'd have known the difference if you'd ever had to. I have stood through a great many silences in my life, on a great many kinds of ground. I have never stood through one like the silence on the range at Hartsmere after the old man finished. It was not the silence of a crowd entertained. It was the silence of a crowd taught, 1,000 people, and the children among them, and the old men in the chairs, all of them recalibrating in a single held breath everything they had thought that morning about the men in the red wool at the ropes, about what the stillness was, about what was and was not under the costume. And Roland Ackley stood in his pale coat in the middle of it. I will give him this at the last, and it is the thing that has kept me, all the years since, from remembering him as merely a fool. He could have done a great many things in that silence. He could have laughed it off and made a joke and let the showman save him. He could have got angry and turned it ugly. He could have walked off the firing point and to his car and never spoken of it again. He did none of those things. He stood there, and I watched the certainty I had seen in his face all day go out of it, the way I had watched it go out of another face, long ago, across a valley I will not name, except that this man would live, and would have to carry it. And then Roland Ackley did the one thing I had not expected, the thing that made me, in the end, not despise him. He came to the firing point, where I stood at my parade rest with my eyes on the air, and he stopped in front of me, and the crowd watched, and he put out his hand. I looked at it, then I looked at him, and I made him stand there a moment with his hand out, not out of cruelty, but because there was one last thing the moment needed, and it was not for me to take his hand quickly and let him off. He needed to feel the weight of the asking. So I let him hold it out in front of the 1,000, the world champion offering his hand to the furniture, and I let the moment be exactly as long as it needed to be. And then I took it. "You'd have lasted more than 10 seconds, he said, quietly. Just for me, the way he'd said the worst things all day, except that there was nothing left in it now but a man trying to find the bottom of how wrong he had been. Where the shooting's real, you'd have—" He stopped. He shook his head. "I don't have the right to even say it." "No," I agreed. "You don't." But I said it without heat, and I kept his hand a moment, and I think he understood that the keeping of it was the nearest thing to forgiveness a man like me had to give. Then I let it go. I did not double anyone's fee or take a cup or any of that. Ackley, to his credit, made good on the wager and more. I heard later that he gave the Soldiers' Fund a great deal that day, far more than his fee, and that he came back the next year and the year after, quietly, no cameras, and shot the public round for the charity like any other man and lost cheerfully to schoolboys, and seemed, by every account, to be working at something in himself. I do not know if he ever finished the work. I hope he did. The cold water in me had no more quarrel with him. It had gone down again, the way it does, back below the worn lid, and I found to my surprise that the lid sat easier than it had in 11 years, as though the one afternoon of letting it up in the right cause, under the right order, had relieved a pressure I had not known I was carrying. I went down off the firing point. The crowd wanted to make a noise at me now, and some of it broke loose, applause, voices, but I did not stop for it. That is not what it was for. I went down to the end of the rope, to the old man in the chair under the rug, and I knelt down beside him so that the wrecked old face and mine were level, the way you kneel beside a man you have served, and I took his still cold hand in my white glove. "Sir," I said. The eyes were wet. The stroke had taken half his face, but it had not been able to touch the eyes, and the eyes were full, and the half of the mouth that still worked moved, and Colonel Aldous Marrow said, very slowly, the last thing he ever said to me, for he was gone before the next charity day came round, and I was glad past telling that I had been there for the saying of it. "Good lad," he said, "now put it down again and go back to your post." So I did. I stood up, and I settled my tunic with my white glove, the small ritual in reverse, stepping back off the one kind of ground onto the other. And the next morning I was on the line at the gate at Castellane in the city, in the wool and the bearskin, eyes on the middle distance, white gloves over a rifle that fires blanks, a parade doll, a beautiful piece of furniture, a man the tourists photograph, and decide there is nothing behind. And behind that unmoving face I held what I have held all my life, the cold quiet under the worn lid, the long pause at the bottom of the breath, the discipline that is the man. People still want to know what goes on behind the face. I have told you what goes on behind mine. There is more there than they think. There is always more there than they think. That is the whole of what the old man taught me on the high ground 20 years ago, and the whole of what I tried, for one afternoon, to teach a champion who had only ever stood on the easy kind of ground. That the loudest skill in the world is hitting the middle, and that the hardest, the truest, the one that no metal is ever struck for, is knowing when not to fire, and that the man who can do the first and chooses the second is not the furniture. He is the only thing in the room worth the name of soldier. I stood that line another 6 years, until they pensioned me off into a quiet life I am glad of, and in all that time I never told the story to a soul, because the not telling was the discipline, and the discipline was the man. I am telling it now only because the old man is gone and the young ones should know it, the boys down the rope who think their job is a joke. It is not a joke. It is the hardest work a man can do, to stand still while the world leans in to find the crack, and to keep the crack closed not because you cannot break but because you have decided, again and every morning, that you will not. There is a man in the wool. There was always a man in the wool. The whole of the discipline is in making sure that no one ever has to know it, and in knowing it yourself every silent hour all the same.